our presentation on how to use podcasts as an archival outreach tool at your chapter from the University of Alabama Society of American Archivists. Our presenters tonight consist of our chapter president, Laura Daly, Aria Skyler, and me, Curtis Forte. We would like to thank the Society of Mississippi Archivists for selecting our presentation and inviting us to present at this meeting. The enthusiasm for archival outreach at the University of Alabama is embodied in the Archives and Communities podcast, produced by the SAA-UA student chapter, designed to highlight community archiving initiatives and the people behind them. 2 seasons, or a total of 6 episodes of the podcast, have been produced so far and have provided valuable insights and experiences to students and archivists alike through stories, networking, skill development, professional paths, and publicity. Although interest in archival careers is steadily growing, it can be challenging for students to find opportunities to apply their knowledge and interests in a project format. One key to success for this project has been creating standardized procedures, templates, and documents to research, schedule, and conduct interviews, as well as quality control guidelines, which are utilized in post-production. With sustainable procedures in place, the podcast will continue to serve as a vehicle for the archival interests of future chapters and support the growth and development of students preparing to enter the archival profession. It is not uncommon that marginalized voices that have been silenced, lost, or underrepresented are discovered by the community archivists we interview, playing an important role in filling in historical gaps and pioneering a more humanistic narrative of history for others to engage with. The podcast topic, Community Archiving Initiatives, is a rich topic that intersects with diversity, anti-oppression, identity, activism, politics, and social justice. A community archive is unique because it typically forms from grassroots initiatives and is owned and stewarded by the community they represent, versus a typical institutional archive having more bureaucratic policies outlining stewardship. To find the archivists behind such projects can be tricky. We start by identifying a community we would like to highlight and search for community archives created by them. So far, the podcast has covered Latino, LGBTQ transgender, Black community, Asian Pacific American, and Arab American initiatives, with many more in progress conducted by our chapter members. We are striving to represent as many diverse communities and initiatives as we possibly can. We try to learn from what has been done to find new perspectives we can explore further. I will now outline a brief summary of our podcast with some images from their archives for you to get a sense of what is covered. Please listen to them if you have a chance, as they really are insightful and thought-provoking. In Episode 1, Richard Chabran discusses his work at the Chicano Studies Library and how he stewarded an early Latino labor rights periodical archive. He discusses the use of his Chicano periodical index and how it enabled better access to resources. He worked at UCLA helping research students get published, and a community center giving free internet access and resources to working-class people in California. He helped develop the Knowledge Reverb program, a framework that outlines different ways of knowing, telling, listening to, and appreciating other cultures with direct community-oriented projects. Richard concludes with his latest project, a Latino digital archive. These are some images of some of the earliest issues of La Raza, a Latino labor rights-oriented periodical that highlights a variety of social issues that affected the Latino population in LA in the 60s. There were 2 types. On the right is a newspaper, and there's also a magazine. So the left one kind of showcases some of the artwork and that was in the magazine. In Episode 2, Josh Burford discusses the Invisible Histories Project, a LGBTQ history archive initiative. As a queer studies teacher, his students wanted to learn more than the typical mainstream LGBTQ history. These lost narratives were buried in library metadata and under incorrect cataloging terms. Josh and the Invisible Histories Project strive to get this material into the hands of communities. Josh discusses the history, suppression, and importance of queer community archives and the significance of being able to interact with historical artifacts associated with LGBTQ history. He concludes that archivists should look for opportunities that speak to their passions and call institutions to network and form partnerships. These images are from the Invisible Histories Instagram and showcase the first archival item and the first Pride Parade that was in Alabama. In episode 3, Lolita Rowe discusses her journey in librarianship and as an archivist. She says if you're not in the narrative, then someone else is writing your history for you. Archives provide lifelong learning in the unspoken narratives of everyday people. Lolita discusses the significance of truly connecting with archival stories and each other. She discusses her Rose Library podcast projects, what she has learned, and how she made the most of them. She concludes that maybe the job you want hasn't been created yet, and to be flexible in your approach to archiving work. In episode 4, Zoe Poley discusses the Black Joy Archive and its initiatives that seek to highlight the positive and healing aspects of Black positivity. She discusses her career as a designer and the importance of community engagement. Giving back to the community, motivated by Black Lives Matter issues, Zoe wanted to create something that would allow her community to have space to therapize positivity and Black human experiences. She discusses her philanthropic initiatives related to the collective archive that she hopes will continue on. She concludes, just do the work, and don't get held up by your perception of what an archive is. These are a few great images from the Black Joy Archive that showcase loving memories from the contributors. There are so many, though, I recommend that you check them out. They're all really great and awesome. In episode 5, Aishia Khan, Austin History Center's Asian American community archivist, discusses her professional path, volunteer projects, and the origins of her archival passions and initiatives. As a community archivist, she works to document underrepresented minorities, reaching out to the communities and building trust authentically, and having an active role with the community you are documenting is crucial, according to Aishia. She helps to empower underrepresented voices, diversify, and help communities preserve their stories at the Asian Pacific American Community Archive with workshops on oral history and language accessibility. These are some images from our archive showing some of the earliest Pacific families that migrated to Austin, Texas. The key to managing a podcast program such as this is to create procedural documents with your chapter members for different activities encompassed in the program, such as interviewing, editing, guidelines, and templates. A few production tips for the podcast. Number 1, invite the person to participate using a pre-written email that you can craft specifically to cater to your interviewee and their project. Number 2, follow up after 4 days if there's no response. If you followed up 2 or 3 times and there's no response, move on to another person from the list of potential interviewees. Number 3, once the person agrees to be interviewed, send them the questions that your chapter creates together and the recording guidelines in advance via email. This gives them an idea of what to expect. Recording guidelines are the same regardless of the interview method you've arranged, whether it is live interview or asynchronous. Also, make sure to do some research on this person's career before the interview. It's a good idea to think of any additional questions you could ask if you run short on time. Some items for open-ended questions are good to have on hand. Number 4, take notes while you interview on the aspects you find important about the person's career and experiences. Once completed, send the interview audio file to your podcast editor and prepare a brief bio of the interviewee. For the interviewer, this step is optional, depending on your level of time commitment. Number 5, episode editing. Following the structure discussed and agreed upon with the editor should be responsible for polishing the podcast and making it ready for publishing. Number 6, after editing the episode, send it to the interviewee for approval before publishing. This communication should ideally include a deadline for feedback, maybe 4 to 5 days. Number 7, correct the episode if needed and publish the episode. What are some fundamental questions for interviewees? Some of them include, what can you tell us about yourself, where are you from, grew up, etc.? Could you tell us about your current position and your responsibilities? Could you share with us what community archiving means to you and how did you become interested in community archiving? Could you tell us about your initiatives and how you arrived at these ideas? To close, do you have any advice for us as emerging archivists interested in this kind of work? A few open-ended questions to keep in mind are, when did you learn about archiving? What path led you to become an archivist? And what do you envision for the future of this project? And accordingly, your chapter can come up with your own questions too. Some recording guidelines for live interviews include pick a quiet room to conduct the interview, silence smartphones, use earphones with an incorporated microphone for the interview to guarantee audio quality and reduction of any background noise. Make sure you do some background research on the person you are interviewing to create specific questions that you will be able to ask during the interview. Some recording guidelines for asynchronous interviews. An asynchronous interview is one where the questions are sent via email and the interviewee records their responses and sends them back. Ask the interviewee to pick a quiet room to record their answers, and ask the interviewee to use earphones with an incorporated microphone for the interview to guarantee audio quality and reduction of any background noise. For recording, give the interviewee the option to use the audio notes app on their smartphone for recording their answers. Ask the interviewee to mention the question they are answering at the beginning of each audio to make it easier for editing. For submitting their audios, give the interviewee the option to submit their audios directly from their smartphone by clicking on the audio button and share button and choose a convenient option such as email or Drive. They can alternatively download the audios to their computers and send them over an online file transfer service such as Mega or WeTransfer. So what does the project manager do? They mainly maintain and update the main podcast Google Doc, which contains the main documents and forums for the project. They also lead podcast group meetings to receive updates and move things along. They oversee podcast editing and production, and they edit training materials. The social media coordinator and website manager promote the podcast using social media sites such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Discord, WordPress website, and MySource. You can customize your social media outreach to cater to your chapter's needs. This is a photo of our current website showcasing the podcast on the main page. And this is our chapter's Facebook page, used for promoting upcoming activities and the podcast. I will now turn it over to Laura, who will discuss the podcast's future trajectory. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Curtis. I'm excited to be here with everyone today. Thank you so much for having us. As the newly elected SAA-UA president for the 2021-22 academic year, I've been excited to continue the podcast with the current chapter and have worked closely with Valeria, the former SAA-UA president and founder of the podcast, to ensure a successful transition. Although it has been a challenge to undertake this project with a small group of busy students, I often reflect on what a great opportunity it is to engage with these amazing professionals and represent their initiatives through the podcast, and I feel extremely fortunate to take part in that. We began by weighing the pros and cons of continuing the podcast for another year, and it was decided that despite it requiring a significant amount of time and effort, the benefits far outweighed the negatives, and it would be worthwhile to continue the project, especially after the extraordinary amount of work put in by Valeria and the previous chapter in its first season. This was a bold undertaking, since most of the previous SAA-UA chapter had just graduated or no longer had time to be involved, leaving a brand new chapter with almost no collective experience with the podcast. Fortunately, the one chapter member, Nick Wansala, who continued on from the previous year, had been actively involved in the podcast and agreed to run for the position of project manager. As a result of the tireless assistance and mentorship from Valeria and Nick's previous experience with the podcast and role as project manager, we have been able to successfully carry the project into a new year. After deciding to keep the podcast project, the next step was to ask the chapter members if they would like to continue with the Archives and Communities theme or change it to a new one. Next slide. We knew we wanted the podcast to be a reflection of the archival interests of the whole chapter, so we decided to put it to a vote. At our first meeting, we suggested a list of themes, including keeping the same one, and asked the chapter to vote on their top 2 choices. Archives and Communities was the top choice, thereby launching us into an exciting second season. We are hopeful that the process of voting to keep or change the theme will be continued each year as new chapter members come with new interests and ideas. Establishing effective workflows for episode production has been key, as described by Curtis with the background of the podcast. Through trial and error, we have been able to identify some areas where changes can be made to make the process smoother and more manageable. The main changes that are being made include 1, adding options to the interview phase, 2, increasing student involvement in the editing and post-production processes, 3, creating additional training materials, and 4, creating a podcast production schedule. Next slide. Thanks, Curtis. Because we encourage as many chapter members as possible to participate in the interview process, varying levels of time commitments can lead to students getting overwhelmed or stuck. This affects not only the experience of the student, which we want to be positive, but it affects the production of the podcast episodes by slowing or potentially losing the progress of an interview. As mentioned previously, a student would make contact with the interviewee and set up an interview, provide interview questions and guidelines to the interviewee, conduct the interview, write a bio and transitional script phrases to be used when editing the interview, and record the bio and transitional script phrases and send to the editor along with the interview audio. Steps 1 through 3 were typically carried out with little problems, but steps 4 and 5 turned out to be more time-consuming and led to not hearing back from students for long periods of time and slowing down the production schedule, or in one case, losing the interview altogether. To address this challenge, we provided students with 3 options after the first 3 steps of the interview process are completed. Option 1, and this is the most significant time commitment, write the bio and transitional script phrases, record them, and send them to the editor. Option 2 is a moderate time commitment, have someone from the podcast team write the bio and transitional script phrases and record them, but still, which can then be used to record the audio files, which will be sent to the editor. And option 3 is the most minimal time commitment, which is have someone from the podcast team write the bio and transitional script phrases and record them, but still receive credit for conducting the interview. So far, adding these options has improved the interview experience for students by allowing them to select their time commitment level and increased the flow of the podcast production schedule. During the first year of the podcast, the majority of editing and post-production responsibilities were carried out by the president and one other member of the chapter. Over the course of the next year, we are planning to provide more resources for students interested in being involved in the editing and post-production phases by creating a series of training materials. The project manager will also be available to teach and train students on a group or individual basis to solidify the information contained in the training materials. This will have two benefits for the chapter. One, increase opportunities for students to gain valuable technical skills and experience, and two, improve the workload distribution of the editing and post-production phases, which can be very time-consuming. While the main podcast, you can go back to the previous one.
Sorry.
That's all right. While the main podcast Google Doc will continue to be accessible and act as an overview of the whole process, expanding the training materials and resources will allow students to learn more about each specific step in the editing and post-production process. Here's an overview of the episode production training materials we hope to create over the course of the year. The training materials would be split into two sections: episode editing training materials and post-production training materials. In the episode editing training materials, the episode structure guidelines will provide an overview of how the episode is constructed, including specifications for the following components: musical intro, post-intro, bio, interview audio, host transition segments, musical outro, and host outro. Creating a consistent format for the episode, you can go back. Creating a consistent format for the episode structure is key for a finished product that sounds professional, engages listeners, and effectively communicates the message of the podcast. The tutorial for editing on Final Cut Pro provides details on how to import the necessary audio files, edit them individually, combine the audio files, and some overall quality control diagnostics. The post-production training materials will be divided into two sections, including the tutorial for exporting files for publishing and guidelines for posting episode notes. The main platforms we use to publish our episodes include Spotify, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. Each platform has unique requirements for how to upload files and what type of formats are accepted. These specifications, as well as a tutorial on how to export the files from Final Cut Pro 7 into the necessary file types, will be included in the tutorial for exporting files for publishing. The guidelines for posting episode notes will illustrate how to include episode notes with the uploaded file on each platform, as well as what content is recommended to create a consistent set of information for each episode. Altogether, these training materials will provide critical resources for future project managers and students who would like to learn and be involved in the episode editing and post-production process. A final change which is being made in the episode production process is the addition of the podcast production schedule. After the project manager has had a chance to meet with the podcast group members, a timeline is discussed and agreed upon with anticipated monthly production dates and editing and post-production signups. By operating on an agreed upon timeline and delegating editing and post-production assignments, the workload can be distributed, efficiency will be increased, and the anticipated production schedule can be advertised more effectively by the chapter. One of the main goals for our podcast is to create a project that is versatile, sustainable, and can be carried forward through future chapters. Because a podcast can explore a variety of archival topics and adapt to a variety of formats, future chapters can use the podcast as a vehicle to explore their current interests. If they so choose, instead of archives and communities, the next chapter may vote to change the theme to archival practices and trends, or DIY archiving. The topic is only limited by the imagination of the current membership. Over the course of the next year, we will be working on creating a master podcast guide, a critical document that will help the president and project manager to lay the groundwork for creating a podcast that is unique to the current chapter. We came up with this idea at the beginning of the semester when we took a vote on keeping or changing the theme of the podcast, and realized that if a different theme was selected by the chapter, we would potentially have to start at square one by reconsidering the interview format versus a different format, workflows, editing, etc. Fortunately for us, the chapter decided to keep the same theme for another season, but the realization of the need for a guide to make the transition process more feasible became apparent. The Master Podcast Guide can accomplish this in 3 steps. 1, choosing a theme. 2, choosing a suitable format. And 3, creating governing documents for the management of the podcast. Steps 1 and 2 will require the ideas and collective decision of the chapter, but step 3 will require the most work to create documentation that reflects and effectively facilitates the podcast process. These documents include a description of the podcast theme, a student involvement sign-up, a summary of the overall podcast process, a podcast publishing schedule, and training materials for episode editing and post-production. Once completed, the Master Podcast Guide will be stored in the online box storage platform, which future chapter leadership will have access to once they take office, along with all other training materials associated with the podcast. By outlining the basic requirements needed for the chapter podcast, half of the work has already been done, and future chapters will have the tools they need to hit the ground running and explore any aspect of the archival world. Producing Archives and Communities Season 2 has given us an opportunity to represent even more diverse communities and highlight the unique initiatives that have been developed within them. We have 1 completed episode that was just produced and several more interviews that are either scheduled or in the editing phase. Our most recent episode features Matthew Stifler with the Oral History and Digital Scrapbooks collection at the Arab American National Museum. Originally a member of a small Lebanese and Syrian Christian population in Pennsylvania, Matthew works directly with the Arab American community by conducting oral history interviews and teaching them how to digitize their own family histories to create a collection that tells the unique story of the Arab American experience. And this interview was conducted by our presenter, Aria. Micki Davis and the Pasifika Collection. A multimedia artist and educator, Micki invites artists from the 9 indigenous diasporas in the Pacific to visit the exhibit located within the Pacific Island Ethnic Art Museum in California and share the cultural significance behind their work and how it represents their communities. Micki also works with the artists to develop a transmission video that is geared towards families and children to teach them about their cultural heritage. Jennifer O'Neill and the Mukurtu Hubs and Spokes Project. Jennifer O'Neill is an assistant professor at the University of Oregon whose teaching focuses on Native American studies and working with Native American communities by empowering them to preserve and represent their culture through technology. Using a free and open source information management platform called Mukurtu, the Hubs and Spokes Project enables multiple Native American communities to digitally create and share their collections based on their local cultural systems. Gail Reimer and the Jewish Women's Archive. In 1995, Gail Reimer founded the Jewish Women's Archive as an organization designed to share the stories and achievements of Jewish women. By examining past and modern events surrounding issues related to women today, the JWA aims to inspire young individuals with successful role models and inspire others to become agents of change within their communities. In addition to representing the archivists and the collections themselves, we are hoping to highlight some of the following questions. What outreach methods are being used to involve the community? What new technologies are being used to facilitate cultural representation, accessibility, and preservation? We are currently researching and hoping to represent some of the following communities for the remainder of Season 2: Alaskan Natives, pandemic essential workers, disabilities community, and the homeless community. And now Aria will present about how the podcast functions as an outreach tool. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. The Archives and Communities podcast has proven itself to be an incredible outreach tool. SAA-UA members who contribute to this project have opportunities to explore their own interests within the vast possibilities of archives. They may also learn something new about a community archive they had never heard of before, as I did. The podcast is a vehicle for chapter members to expand their knowledge and educate one another. Students have the opportunity to gain experience conducting research and use that knowledge firsthand in their interview. They will develop skills such as communicating effectively with professionals, both in person and through email, establish or strengthen interviewing techniques, and have the opportunity to learn about podcast development, which is a unique skill they can carry with them into their future careers. As they develop rapport, students may network with the professionals they interview, strengthening their future careers as they move into the job market after their graduation. I myself am an example of the benefits of this podcast, as Laura mentioned. I had the pleasure of interviewing Matthew Stifler, the research and content manager at the Arab American National Museum. I had no idea that such a museum existed before setting up my interview with Matthew. My perspectives were broadened as a result of this project. I was given the contact information for Matthew from the chapter and proceeded with setting up the interview on my own. The interview itself was nerve-wracking and a major learning experience. Not only did I learn about my own strengths and weaknesses when conducting interviews and in which areas I can improve, I also learned something new about my own community. As a white woman born and raised in rural East Tennessee, my perspectives tend to be a bit limited. After talking with Matthew, however, I learned just how diverse the Arab American community is. He informed me that there is a large Arab American population in the South. In fact, the day we conducted our interview, he had been working on collecting and digitizing the history of Selma Roosevelt, a daughter of Lebanese Druze immigrants born in Kingsport, Tennessee. She married a grandson of former President Theodore Roosevelt and served as chief of protocol in the 1980s. Before that day, I had never heard of this important woman who was born in a town less than 80 miles from me. At the top of the slide is a picture of the exterior of the Arab American National Museum. At the bottom is a photo of Selma Roosevelt. After writing my script for the voiceover transitions, recording them, and sending them to the person who would edit the episode and put it all together, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride and accomplishment, and I was eager to conduct another interview. I was so excited to share this podcast with my friends and family and to have the opportunity to help educate others on communities they might not know much about as well. Professionals who are interviewed for the podcast have the opportunity to promote themselves and their accomplishments, as well as the goals, values, and accomplishments of the institution they are representing. They may network with one another through the shared experience of the podcast, with the students they are being interviewed by, and with the Archival Studies Department at the University of Alabama, creating circumstances for a wide range of connections. Community outreach, a major goal of the Community Archive, is enhanced through the sharing of the podcast and the subsequent connections it creates. The beauty of a public, easily accessible podcast is that anyone can listen to these interviews at any time, anywhere in the world. The possibilities really are endless. In addition, professionals may use this podcast interview as an idea generator. They may bring the idea of a podcast back to their own institutions or choose to adopt another outreach method that was discussed by professionals in other episodes. Adopting new techniques can make collections more accessible. Previous interviews summarize what has made an archive successful, and those ideas can be applied by other institutions and communities. Increased awareness of diverse communities is a direct result of this project. We begin the process by searching for archives specifically dedicated to diverse, often underrepresented communities. Increased awareness begins here. As we search, we uncover new communities and initiatives unbeknownst to us. When the episode is available for consumption, wider public awareness of the community and its initiatives is made possible. This is not to say that these archives were undiscovered, but that the Archives and Communities podcast aids each archive featured in a common goal of community outreach. Students are able to engage with the professionals they interview, asking any questions they might have outside of the suggested questions given in the podcast guide. This facilitates further archival interest not only for the student, but also for the SAA chapter and podcast listeners. The professionals that are interviewed for each episode educate listeners about current archival trends and practices in the field today. As we know, archival science is a constantly changing field, developing alongside technological advances. Through the sharing of knowledge during the interview, students, professionals, and listeners alike may walk away with new or expanded ideas about archival practices. Finally, the Archives and Communities podcast has the ability to encourage listeners to participate in community archives. In the description of each episode we post, we provide links and resources to each archive featured, so listeners have the option to explore the initiative further and volunteer with or contribute to the archive. They may also be inspired to search for archive initiatives in their local communities. The Archives and Communities podcast gives students, professionals, archives, and the communities they represent a chance to connect with one another on a deeper level through the sharing of histories and the common goals of preservation and continued education. After all, isn't that what an archive is all about? Thank you so much for listening. Here we have our handles to our social media and links to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and to our chapter website.
Thank you, Aria. That was excellent. So yeah, I'll go ahead and stop the.
Thanks so much. This was super interesting. So we're going to open the floor up for questions now. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to turn on your mic, turn on your video, or enter something into the chat box. Whatever you feel most comfortable doing. I did have a question, and I apologize if you touched on this, but are you planning on you said you were going to come up with like this master how-to guide. Are you planning on making that open source?
So we were actually asked that in a different presentation that we had done as well. I think that we are planning to make it available because, I mean, part of, as I think Aria talked about, part of the whole mission of this podcast is to, create discussions and educate the community on different archival topics. And so if more people, are interested in copying that format, then that's great. And we would love for that to happen. So we haven't, created them in their entirety yet. We're in the process, but I think once we complete them, hopefully by the end of this academic year, we'll be making them available. So the training materials, and then also potentially the master podcast guide.
Yeah, I think that would be extremely helpful. If you could make that open source somewhere so anyone can use it as a how-to guide. But you have another question that came in on the chat. Jamie asked, first Jamie says, thank you for this wonderful talk. I was curious, how do you find people to interview for the podcast?
Me personally, I saw the Google Doc that, Laura, did you create the Google Doc with the different communities that we might want to cover?
Yeah, so Valeria created it initially, and then we kind of created a new year and different ideas. But yeah, keep going, Aria.
From there, I looked at that Google Doc, and from there, I just search on Google, really, and just look around and see what I can find. And I've come across some really interesting things.
Yeah, Aria has come up with some amazing projects, several of which we are either in the process of interviewing or, are hoping to set up. But it is actually a really tricky process. It's time consuming because you can't just Google, community archives and come up with a list of great, non-institutional community archive projects. So what we found is the most effective, and I think Curtis talked about this a little bit in his part, is to identify a community that you would like to represent. And then once you have that in mind, then really dive into, archives that are about that community, and then potentially, community archives that are being developed, because it's kind of a new trend, and it's just kind of gaining popularity. And so sometimes they can be really difficult to find, but that's kind of how we go about it.
Great. So have the community archives that you've interviewed, what benefits have they gotten as a part of this partnership and being interviewed? Have they noted anything, any significant maybe like uptick in interest in their project? Have they noted anything related to that?
Don't know that we've had any specific experiences that have been shared with us. I know that the communities that we've worked with, the archivists that we've worked with, rather, have, shared our podcast episodes and shared our work that we're doing, and so there's been a lot of collaboration, and they're definitely very grateful for the increased exposure. But yeah, I guess we're still pretty new in this beginning of the second season with 6 episodes. So hopefully we will, we might potentially reach out in the future and say, hey, what difference did this make? Or did you see, notice an increase in traffic or anything like that? So that's actually a good idea for something in the future for us to kind of research a little bit more.
Does anyone else have any other questions for our speakers? Okay, Jamie asked another question. Do you have any advice for other student groups interested in starting a similar project? Curtis, I think your mic disconnected again. Or maybe you just need to pull down the mic. Yeah, we can't hear you still. Like he may be either typing his answer or Curtis is going back to having a good documentation that is sustainable. It can be replicated accordingly. Okay, yeah. That comment about sustainable, I think is key. Laura and Aria, would you agree with that? Okay, any other?
Can I also add to that just one thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think definitely if it's a chapter that's trying to start a podcast, really trying to find out what your chapter is interested in, and what gets them excited, because I think that's a big part of what makes the podcast successful, is that we have students who are really excited about the work that we're doing. And so if you can figure out what that is, then everything else is going to go a lot better, because it does take a lot of work. And so when students are really invested and feel like they're researching things they're interested in, then they're more likely to do the work and collaborate together and work together to make it happen.
And Katie says, thanks, y'all. Very excited to listen to all these episodes. Ash states, no questions, but thank you for sharing. This is an ambitious project, and I'm going to check out the podcast. I think you're going to have a lot of new listeners. So thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. We were very excited to host a group of students, and all of you talking about this highly ambitious project. I agree that it is very ambitious. For students to be taking on a project of this magnitude. So I'm definitely going to check out your podcast as well, and I'm excited to listen to your content. All right. So do any of you have any lasting thoughts that you would like to share?
No, just thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to keep anyone here longer than we have to be. But I want to thank all of our participants for being here as well. As soon as the video for this talk generates, I will post it to our YouTube group. And everyone should get a follow-up email from the event that has the link to our YouTube channel in that message. I also want to remind, if we have any SMA members here today, that we are hosting our board meeting tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. We'll be doing it via WebEx, and here is the link to that event if you would like to join us. All members are invited. And we will be hosting our next virtual table talk later this semester. I'm thinking early December is when we're going to schedule that for. But be on the lookout for that information to drop on various listservs very soon. Okay, so again, thank you to our speakers. We do appreciate you being here, and I hope everyone has a great day. Bye, everyone.